now that I have some caffeine in my system, I can say welcome to the analysis of William Blake's Garden of Love. I'm going to give you some background to William Blake, the Romantic movement. I'm going to give you a bit of background to where this was published. We're going to have a look at the vocab within the poem, not anything major. We're going to have a look at the structure, and then we're going to go into an analysis. During the analysis, you'll also see in my open space over here that when I speak about specific areas, I'll put up what I think would potentially be Matric questions on this poem, based on the style of questioning within paper 2 of previous years. So that will be there. If I'm feeling generous, I might even put in the answer as to what I think some of those the answers might be to some of those questions. So a bit of a background on William Blake and on his poetry. He's a romantic poet. He's a forerunner of the romantic movement. And he was writing in the late 1700s into the first quarter of the 1800s. The romantic movement extended beyond that, but he's, from today's perspective, seen as a forerunner of that movement. And the reason for that is within the romantic movement, and indeed within Blake's poetry, there is a celebration of the natural world. There is a disdain of organized politics, of organized religion, of the specific economic structure of the time, of the growing industrialization, of the growing remove of humanity from the natural world, or at least as perceived by people at the time. And Blake's poetry is very much situated within that. The poem Garden of Love comes from a collection of his poems called Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience. And within that, the Songs of Innocence are those that champion this natural world, this world of the spirit and the soul, this world that is free of organized religion, but which is still immensely spiritual, and also sensual. There's a celebration of the sexual as well, which comes into this poem, but from the opposite angle. The Songs of Experience are the opposite of all of that. They decry the situation that he sees around him. They decry the disconnection of humanity with the natural world. They decry the political situation. They decry what it is that organized religion is doing, what it is that organized politics is doing. So Garden of Love is published within that. And it's an illustrated poem because Blake studied as an artist. So he illustrated pretty much all of his work. And it's interesting that as within the English subject for high school, for Matric, we don't look at the image. But I wanted to show the image because I think there's a subtle depth of understanding that image brings. So if you have a look at the image, you see a priest and 2 young people praying. And with the title Garden of Love, it appears as if we have a poem that would likely fit into Songs of Innocence. It appears as if it's a very innocent seeming poem, and yet this poem was in Songs of Experience because of Blake's specific reading and understanding of organized religion. So what appears within our title, Garden of Love, it sounds beautiful. What appears within the image, this innocent praying, is in fact not what the poem delivers. So that's something of the background, something of where it was published, something of the romantic movement. In terms of structure, note how you have 3 stanzas of 4 lines each. So 3 stanzas of 3 quatrains. I'm talking rubbish. But those stanzas are all quatrains because they're 4 lines each. Note also the rhythm. So what you have, if I'm not mistaken, and you can count this out, what you have is something like 8 syllables in the first, I've lost my place here, there we go, 8 syllables in the first stanza, and then in the second stanza, the first 3 lines I think are 9 syllables, the next one is 7, you can double check me on that. And then in the third stanza, I think it's something like 7, 8, and then 10, possibly 11. So we go from a fairly repetitive number of syllables to a last stanza where those last 2 lines are a lot more forceful because of the additional syllables. We also see that in the first 2 stanzas there's rhyme, whereas in the last stanza there's no rhyme, and structurally that becomes important because of what happens in terms of meaning in that last stanza. So in your first stanza, your rhyme scheme is A, B, A, I'm talking rubbish again. In your first stanza, your rhyme scheme is A, B, C, B. In your second stanza, it is D, E, F, E. And then you've got no rhyme in your last stanza. So what that does, what the break in the number of syllables does, and what the break in the rhyme pattern does, is it calls attention quite forcefully to that last stanza. And when we get to unpacking the meaning, we'll see why that's important. Then just in terms of vocab, it helps if you have some kind of Christian background. If you don't have a Christian background, the poem becomes a little bit tricky to unpack. A chapel, which should be pictured here, around about now, is a small church. And it has connotations of hominess or coziness. It's generally a place that has positive connotations, not negative connotations. That's in your third line. In your fourth line, where it says, I used to play on the green, he's not just referring to, I used to play on an open piece of land. He's referring to a common. He's referring to a piece of land that was open for everyone. And when we think about that within Blake's politics, within Blake's perception of the world, he would have, the fact that it was an open piece of land, the fact that it wasn't owned by anyone, would have been something that appealed to him, or appealed to those romantic sensibilities that he had. The word writ, just an old-fashioned word, old-fashioned version of wrote and written, or written over the door. And nothing else in the second stanza that I think will be of issue. A tombstone obviously is a grave marker, and you should know what a priest is if you don't. Religious. From a Christian background, it is a religious leader within the Christian church. And walking their rounds refers, I would assume it's prayer rounds, because if you go back into sort of early Christianity or Catholicism, there's this idea of what a priest should do is pray, I think it's meant to be every 3 hours. And so the church bells would ring to call a priest to pray every 3 hours. If we think about that again within what we know about Blake's understanding of the world, that would be a peculiarly unhelpful way to spend your time, simply walking around and praying. Now, I'm not necessarily advocating for his view of Christianity. It's his view of Christianity, but I am going to help to unpack his view of Christianity. Black gowns, that's what they would have worn. Binding's an interesting word. It means tying, but when we get to it in the context, hopefully my little goldfish brain will remember to unpack the connotations of binding, because it's not as simple as just tying up. The word briars refers to a thorny plant, and again, the connotations here are rich because of the Christian background and the sort of reference to the thorns in Christ's cross and Christ's crown. Okay, so the Garden of Love, in the first 2 lines, it seems completely innocuous. It seems like he's going to this beautiful place and he saw something he's never seen before. So it seems as if, just like the title is innocuous, those first two lines, it seems as if this is potentially a good thing. I went to the Garden of Love and saw what I never, blah, blah, blah. I went to the Garden of Love and saw what I never had seen. A chapel was built in the midst. I forgot to unpack midst for you guys. Midst means middle of it. So a chapel was built in the middle of this green where I used to play. So once upon a time, we get the sense that when the speaker was a child, this was an open area, an area for play. And still, in that first stanza, this doesn't necessarily appear like a bad thing, because if you have a positive association with the church, if you have a positive association with Christianity, you think, well, oh, well, that's quite cool, they've built a church. From Blake's perspective, we're going to see it's not cool at all that they built a church. They've claimed a space, they've claimed the church has claimed a space that was common to all, and they've also then restricted it, which we see beginning to happen in stanza 2. And the gates of this chapel were shut. So here, where we had this open green that was free access to everyone, where our speaker played and enjoyed himself as a child, here it's shut. Here he cannot enter. He's being barred from this space. And thou shalt not was written over the door. Of course, the language thou shalt speaks to the Old Testament. It speaks to the 10 Commandments. So first stanza, the freedom, the joy of this natural world, of the green, which also symbolizes the natural world, being replaced by a closed off space, a space that prohibits, a space that doesn't allow for certain behaviors. Thou shalt not. And it's interesting that the poem doesn't specify what you're not allowed to do. It just says thou shalt not. And so the implication of that is that you're not allowed to do anything. Is that these prescriptions are so broad that they cover almost everything. And all we see from Blake's perspective of religion is that it is an organization that prohibits, not an organization, and this I'm sure is how some people experience Christianity, not an organization that encourages love or connectedness or even just friendship, it would seem. So I turned to the Garden of Love that so many sweet flowers bore. So when I saw this chapel was there and I realized I couldn't get in, I turned to the Garden of Love. I turned to the open space where it used to bear flowers. Bore is the past tense. So the implication is it's no longer bearing these flowers. And of course our third stanza is the kicker. Here is where we really see that things change. And that the control of the church becomes incredibly negative. So I turned to the Garden of Love that so many sweet flowers bore, and I saw it was filled with graves and tombstones where flowers should be. So it's not that unusual if you were to think about it. A chapel is often associated with graves. It's often where we bury our dead. It's considered holy or hallowed ground. But in the imagery that Blake is creating for us, in the world that he's creating, he created a world where that green was open and free. He created a world where he had fun as a child, where he played as a child, where there were sweet flowers, a sense of enjoyment within the flowers. And now those graves and those tombstones, what do they represent? They represent death. They represent the opposite of the life, of the joy, of the freedom that that green gave him. And it's the connection to the church in which it symbolizes death. So the church, organized religion, is a bringer of that death, as it were. And not a physical death, a metaphysical death, a spiritual death, that because of this thou shalt not, because of the strictures, because of the containment by this religion, the freedom is lost. And with the loss of freedom, so the life is lost. And I saw it was filled with graves and tombstones where flowers should be, and priests in black gowns were walking their rounds and binding with briars my joys and desires. It's such an angry last two lines. Priests in black gowns, note the black. Yes, it's something that we associate with the priesthood, but look at the context of the poem. It's associated with death. It's associated with the bringing of death, the bringing of spiritual death. They're walking their rounds, and I've already discussed that, and binding with briars my joys and desires. So these priests are taking thorns, which is such an evocative image here because it's a reference to the thorn of Christ, the crown of thorns of Christ. They're taking thorns and they're tying up his joys and desires. They're tying up the things that he wants to do. Now, binding is not simply like tying, because I'm going to say, if I look at the diction, if I look at the word choice of the poetry, I'm going to say, I tie my shoelaces, or I tied a knot in the string. But when it comes to binding something, he was bound in slavery. He was bound in chains. So the word itself has these connotations of a loss of freedom, of being captured or enslaved in some way, shape, or form. So the priests have captured, have enslaved his joys and desires. These innocent joys and desires that as a child he experienced on the green. Now, he hasn't just said joys, he said joys and desires. So the desires suggests something sexual, something sensual. And part of what Blake is saying here is that organized religion has constricted humanity's natural sensuality, humanity's natural sexuality, the natural joy that human beings can take in their sexuality. They've constricted it, they've said thou shalt not. And as such, humanity is removed from that natural world, is removed from that the world of green, the world of life, the world of flowers, the world of sweetness. And what is left is a space where you are barred, where things die, where there is death. So I'm not sure how it's going to work with giving the questions on the side. I'm going to see how that works in post-production. If it doesn't work in post-production, then I might just do another video on what I think some of the questions might be. Definitely you're looking at things like the contrast between the opening stanzas and the final stanza. You know, what is the world that he first sets up versus, or the space that he first sets up versus the space that he later ends up in? What is the message of the poem? How does the title connect to the message? Garden of Love. If you think also of Garden of Love, and if you think of everything that we've unpacked here in terms of sensuality and sexuality and the church's constraints around these things, then we can also begin to understand Garden of Love as a reference to Garden of Eden, to a time of innocence prior to the fall of mankind. And of course the fall of mankind is seen as a sort of parable for the gaining of sexual knowledge. So human beings, according to the Old Testament and according to the sort of Christian interpretation, became sinful because they realized that they were naked, became sinful because they had an understanding of sex and sexuality. And here what Blake is saying is that no, what is sinful, what is associated with death is the church. What is natural, what is sweet, what is joyful is humanity's enjoyment of their sensuality and their sexuality. I'm trying to think of what other questions. Definitely, if it were up to me, if I were asking the Matric questions, I would ask on binding, in terms of diction, discuss the effectiveness of the diction, or discuss the effectiveness of the image binding with briars. If I think of anything else, I'll post it under this video. But I hope it's helped. And if you do have questions, please ask. When and if I have the time, I will definitely, that's an oxymoron. When I have the time, I will try and respond. I can't say I'll definitely respond. So thanks for watching.